I was sitting in my car when my parents called me. The engine was off. The vineyard parking lot had almost completely emptied out. Most of the guests had already left, the last few headlights disappearing down the long road that curved between the rows of grapevines. The sun was almost gone, leaving behind that soft orange glow that lingers right before everything turns dark. My wedding dress was still on, perfectly clean, perfectly pressed. Exactly the way it had looked that morning when I stepped into it with shaking hands and 100 different emotions running through my head. Which, in a strange way, meant the day had gone exactly the way a wedding day is supposed to go. I had taken off my heels. They were sitting on the passenger seat next to me, one tipped sideways against the door. My veil was folded carefully in my lap. In my hand, I was holding a cheap gas station coffee that I didn't even remember buying. And I was laughing. Not the kind of laugh you do when something is funny. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when a day has been so overwhelming, so emotional, that your brain doesn't quite know how to process it anymore. The kind of laugh that slips out when the adrenaline finally drains away, because it had been a long day, a beautiful day, but also a complicated one. My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced down. Caller ID, Mom and Dad, both of them, on the same call. Now, if you've ever had parents who like to operate as a united front during serious conversations, you know exactly what that means. My parents almost never called together. If my mom had something to say, she called. If my dad had something to say, he called. But a joint call, that meant something had gone very wrong, or at least they believed it had. I stared at the screen for a second before answering, not because I didn't want to pick up, but because by that point in the evening, I already had a pretty good idea of what the conversation was going to be about. I swiped to answer. The first thing I heard was my mother crying. Not quiet crying either. Real crying. Loud breathing. Broken sentences. That shaky voice people get when they're so emotional they can't even form full words anymore. The kind of crying that usually means something terrible has happened. Then my dad started talking, and he wasn't much better. Now my father is not a man who cries easily. In my entire life, I had seen him cry exactly twice. Once at his mother's funeral, and once during a car commercial that had something to do with a soldier coming home to his dog. So hearing him like this on the phone was unexpected. He said my name slowly, like he was trying very hard to hold himself together. "Claire, we didn't know it was going to turn out like this." My mom tried to say something but broke down again halfway through the sentence. I leaned back in the driver's seat and took a slow sip of my coffee. And I want to be honest here. My first reaction wasn't panic. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even concern. My first thought was, well, there it is, right on schedule. Because by the time that call came in, I had been expecting it for hours, maybe even weeks. I looked out through the windshield at the empty rows of vines stretching into the distance before I finally spoke. "Did something happen?" I asked. My mom tried to answer again. "She's devastated, Claire," she said through tears. "Completely devastated." I didn't need to ask who she meant. I already knew. Amber, my younger sister. The reason this entire situation existed in the first place. My dad cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice tight. "You didn't have to embarrass her like that." That was the moment I almost laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it was so incredibly predictable. I rubbed my forehead and looked down at my hand, at the brand new wedding ring on my finger. It had been there for less than 8 hours. I had gotten married that afternoon, to Daniel, the best man I've ever known. The ceremony had been perfect. The weather had been perfect. The vineyard looked exactly the way I had imagined it for the past 6 years. White chairs between the vines, the breeze moving through the leaves, the sunset slowly painting everything gold while we said our vows. People had laughed. People had cried. My friends had danced like idiots during the reception. My husband had given a speech that somehow made everyone emotional and laughing at the same time. It had been, without question, the best day of my life. But it had also been something else. It had been the day my family finally ran headfirst into something they couldn't manipulate. And they still didn't understand that yet. Not completely. My dad was still talking. "You could have handled this differently." I leaned my head back against the seat and stared up at the roof of the car. "Handled what differently?" I asked calmly. There was a pause, a long one. Then my mom said the sentence that basically summarized my entire childhood. "You knew what Amber thought today was going to be." I closed my eyes for a second, because that sentence right there explained everything. Amber thought something, and the rest of the world was expected to rearrange itself around it. That had been the pattern for 29 years. Amber wanted something. Amber needed something. Amber was upset about something, and the family adjusted. Usually the person doing the adjusting was me, because I was the older sister, because I was mature, because I was reasonable, because I was the one who understood. Which, in our family, was just a polite way of saying, "Claire will give in eventually," and most of the time I had, but today had been different. I opened my eyes again. "Dad," I said calmly. "Yes. Did you read the document you signed?" The silence on the other end of the phone was immediate, and that silence told me everything I needed to know, because if he had read it, we wouldn't be having this conversation. My dad sounded confused. "What document?" I smiled a little, not a cruel smile, just the quiet smile someone makes when a very long plan works exactly the way it was supposed to. "The event agreement," I said. My mom sniffed loudly. "Claire, this isn't about paperwork." But it was. It had been about paperwork the entire time. That was the part nobody in my family understood. They thought the important moment in this story had been 3 weeks earlier. The moment they called and asked me to share my wedding venue with Amber. They thought that was when everything had been decided. But they were wrong. The most important moment had happened later, when my father signed something he hadn't bothered to read, because he assumed the word yes meant the same thing it had always meant. That Claire would adjust. That Claire would make space. That Claire would make things easier for everyone else. Except this time, the yes meant something very different. I took another sip of my coffee and stared out at the now-dark parking lot. "Claire," my dad said slowly, "your sister thought today was going to be a celebration for her too." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I know," I said. "You let her believe that." I almost laughed again. "I didn't let her believe anything," I replied. "I told you exactly what you asked for." My mom sounded frustrated now. "You said she could have her engagement party at the vineyard." "Yes," I said. "I did say that." Another long pause. Then my dad said the sentence that told me he was finally starting to understand. "But that's not what happened today." I glanced down at my phone screen. A text notification was still sitting there. Amber. She had sent it about an hour earlier. The first message she'd sent me all day. I hadn't opened it yet. I probably would. Eventually. But not yet. Because if you really want to understand why my parents were crying on the phone in a vineyard parking lot after my wedding, you need to go back 3 weeks. Back to the moment my phone rang during dinner. Back to the moment my mother said a sentence that started this entire mess. "Claire," she had said carefully, "we have a small favor to ask." And if there's one thing I've learned about my family, it's that nothing they call a small favor is ever small. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was sitting at my kitchen table eating dinner when my phone rang. It was my mom. At first, I didn't think much about it. She called a few times every week. Most of the time, it was something ordinary, family gossip, updates about relatives, or questions about the wedding. Which cousin had confirmed? Which aunt needed a hotel recommendation? Whether I had remembered to invite someone's new boyfriend? Normal things. But the moment I answered the phone, I could hear something strange in her voice. She sounded careful. Not sad, not upset. Just careful in that overly polite way people sound when they're about to ask for something they already know might be a problem. "Hey, sweetheart," she said warmly. "Hi, Mom. How's the wedding planning going?" I looked around my apartment. My dining table had disappeared under a mountain of wedding chaos. Seating charts, color swatches, vendor invoices, a half-finished stack of RSVP cards I had been sorting while eating dinner. It had taken Daniel and me almost a year to organize everything. Every detail had been planned, every schedule finalized, every contract signed. "Pretty good," I said. "Almost everything's done." That part was true. At that point, the wedding had practically started running on autopilot. The venue was booked. The caterer was finalized. The music was arranged. The decorations were approved. There wasn't much left to do except show up and get married. My mom hummed softly. "That's great," she said. Then the pause came. It wasn't long, but it was long enough. If you grow up in a family long enough, you start recognizing certain pauses the same way you recognize certain facial expressions. This was the pause my mom used when she was about to introduce a request she had already decided I should agree to. Then she said it. "Your sister wanted to talk to you about something." Right on cue. Amber. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "Okay," I said slowly. "She's really excited about something," my mom continued. "And we thought maybe you could help." There it was again, that phrase, "maybe you could help." I rubbed my temple. "Help how?" My mom hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke quickly, like someone ripping off a bandage. "Well, Amber and Jason just got engaged." I blinked. "What?" "It happened last night," my mom said. "He proposed at dinner." I sat up a little straighter. That was news to me. Amber had been dating Jason for about 8 months, which, for most people, might feel a little fast. But Amber had always been someone who liked things to happen quickly. Big announcements, big reactions, big attention. "Wow," I said carefully. "That was sudden." "She's very happy," my mom replied immediately. "I'm sure she is." The silence returned again. And this time it felt heavier, because now I knew there was a second part coming. There's always a second part. Then my mom said the sentence that finally revealed the real reason for the call. "Well, Amber was thinking, since your wedding is already planned and all the relatives will be there." I closed my eyes. I already knew where this was going. Maybe she could celebrate her engagement there too. There it was. Exactly where I expected it. I didn't answer right away. My mom rushed to fill the silence. "It wouldn't be anything big," she added quickly. "Just a small announcement. Maybe a toast." I stared down at the RSVP cards on the table. Each one represented someone traveling to celebrate one specific event. Daniel and me. That had been the plan for 12 months. But in my family, plans had always had a strange way of shifting when Amber wanted something. My mom continued. "You know how excited she is, and everyone will already be there. It would be such a perfect moment." I took a slow breath before asking the question that actually mattered. "Did Amber ask me herself?" My mom hesitated. "Well, she felt a little awkward about it." Of course she did. Amber had never liked asking me for things directly. It was much easier when our parents handled those conversations for her. "So you're asking instead," I said. "We're just trying to make everyone happy," my mom replied quickly. That sentence again, "everyone happy," which translated into normal language usually meant one thing, Amber happy. Then I heard movement on the other end of the phone. My dad's voice appeared in the background. "Put me on speaker." A second later, his voice came through clearly. "Claire," he said, "it's not a big deal." I rubbed my forehead slowly. "We're not asking you to change anything," he continued. "Just let her have a moment. 5 minutes during the reception." 5 minutes. It sounded so small when he said it like that. But I had grown up watching how Amber's 5 minutes usually turned into something much bigger. 5 minutes became a speech. A speech became a celebration. And somehow the attention always shifted exactly where Amber wanted it. My mom softened her voice. "Sweetheart, you've always been the understanding one." That line again. The one they used when they wanted me to give something up without arguing. because I was older, because I was reasonable, because I was the one who didn't make things difficult. In other words, because I usually gave in. I looked over at the calendar hanging on my wall. 3 weeks. That's how long it was until the wedding. 3 weeks until the one day that was supposed to belong entirely to Daniel and me. I thought about him for a moment, about the year we had spent planning this, about how excited he was, about how many times he had told me he just wanted the day to be simple and happy. My mom must have sensed my hesitation. "Claire," she said gently, "this would mean so much to her." There was another pause. Then my dad added one final push. "Come on, it's family." I stared at the table for a long moment. Then I spoke. "Okay." The relief on the other end of the phone was immediate. "Really?" my mom said. "Yes," I replied calmly. My dad chuckled. "See," he said, "I told you she'd understand." I kept my voice steady. "She can have her engagement moment." My mom sounded thrilled. "Oh, Amber will be so happy." "I'm sure she will," I said. My dad asked, "So we're all good?" "Yes," I said. "We're good." After we hung up, the apartment felt unusually quiet. I sat at the table for a long time without moving. Then I slowly reached toward the stack of wedding paperwork. There was one contract in particular I needed to read again. The venue agreement. Specifically, the section about event scheduling and approved activities during the reception. I read the clause carefully. Then I read it again. And that's when I opened my laptop. Not to email my parents, not to message Amber, but to write a message to the venue coordinator. Because my parents thought the important moment in that phone call had been when I said yes. But the truth was, the important moment came after I said yes. 3 days later, my father signed a document he hadn't bothered to read. And that document changed everything about what was going to happen on my wedding day. 3 days after that phone call, my parents came over to my apartment. They said they wanted to check in on the wedding planning, but the moment my dad walked in, he went straight for the dining table. Not a casual glance. He went right for the paperwork, flipping through folders with a practiced hand, like he had memorized the layout of every contract, seating chart and vendor agreement over the past year. Everything was spread out neatly, organized just as I had left it, yet suddenly felt like a battlefield. My mom sat across from me, smiling in that careful, rehearsed way people do when they want to keep tension under control. It was the smile that said, "We're here to help, but don't make us explain ourselves too much." "So," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, "Amber is really excited about the little announcement." I nodded. "I figured." That word, little announcement, felt like a weapon wrapped in tissue paper. To anyone else, it sounded innocent. To me, it was the culmination of 3 weeks of subtle manipulation, the exact way my family worked whenever Amber wanted something. My dad picked up one of the folders and flipped through it like he understood exactly what he was looking for. "You've got a lot of paperwork here," he said. "That's weddings," I replied, keeping my voice calm. He chuckled, a sound that tried to mask authority but failed. He set the papers down, leaned back slightly, and then added, "Well, speaking of paperwork," his eyes met mine for a brief second. "Amber's fiancé, Jason's family wants to contribute a little to the reception." I froze, just a little. "Contribute how?" I asked carefully. "Just financially," my dad said quickly, leaning forward as if speed would sell honesty. "Since they'll be celebrating too, they thought it would be nice to help cover some of the costs." My mom nodded, chiming in. "It's actually very generous of them." I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. Both were calm, collected, but underneath the surface, I could feel the rhythm of control. They had never offered to help with a single wedding expense before. Daniel and I had been paying for everything ourselves. And suddenly, the conversation shifted, as though this little contribution was a favor being handed down, wrapped in politeness. "So what do you need from me?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. My dad reached into his briefcase and pulled out a few sheets of paper, sliding them across the table. "We just need to update the event authorization form for the venue," he said. "It allows an additional announcement and toast during the reception." I picked up the papers carefully, flipping through them. They looked harmless, an addendum, short and bureaucratic. It seemed like a routine approval. My mom leaned in. "It's really just a formality," she said. "The venue just needs approval from everyone involved." I held the pen in my hand, feeling the weight of it. The pen wasn't just a writing tool. It was the power they were trying to control, the part of the day they assumed would bend to their will. "You already talked to the venue about it?" I asked. "Of course," my dad said confidently. "Everything's approved, they just need signatures." That part was technically true. The venue had signed off, but only based on the version of the agreement I had sent them earlier that week, which had carefully hidden a detail they would never notice. A small clause, buried at the bottom, invisible to anyone skimming the form. A clause that would determine responsibility for any additional fees. I tapped the pen lightly against the table, pretending to think, while internally, my pulse quickened. They believed they were in control. They thought the paper was just routine. "Let's just get it signed so everything's official," my dad added, sliding the folder closer. I looked down at the form again, calm, deliberate. I signed. Later that evening, Daniel signed too, barely glancing at the document. Weddings came with mountains of paperwork. One more page was nothing in his eyes. The signatures were collected. The paperwork was folded, stacked, and most importantly, removed from my apartment. My dad neatly tucked the forms into his briefcase the next day. "Perfect," he said, closing the briefcase. "This will make things easier for everyone." My mom hugged me before they left. "You're doing a really kind thing," she whispered. I smiled politely. Then, once the door clicked shut, I sat back down at the table, letting my hands hover over my laptop. The screen glowed faintly in the dim apartment light. I reopened the email thread with the venue coordinator, the original message I had sent weeks earlier, carefully worded. Then I opened the copy of the updated contract, and that's when I saw it. The clause, hidden, buried, almost invisible. It stated that any couple requesting a public engagement announcement during another wedding reception would be responsible for covering a separate event activation fee. A large fee, not just a minor amount, but a number that could make even seasoned couples pause. And the responsibility for that payment would fall on the person who submitted the request, who, according to the signed paperwork now sitting in my father's briefcase, was him. The realization hit in a quiet, almost clinical way. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it sink in. Everything, the phone call, the veiled requests, the rehearsed smiles, was exactly as I had predicted. They thought they were guiding the day, controlling the narrative, and ensuring Amber had her moment. Instead, they had signed themselves into responsibility. I picked up my coffee cup, now cold, and took a slow sip. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. The very people who spent their lives orchestrating every event, every conversation, every detail, had unknowingly handed me leverage. And I hadn't even needed to explain it to them yet. Because now the game had changed. Not in some dramatic, confrontational way, at least, not yet, but in the quiet, unspoken reality of power. A single, overlooked clause had shifted responsibility in a family that prided itself on control and manipulation. They thought they were clever. I smiled to myself, knowing that cleverness, like any plan built on assumptions, could unravel with a single signature. And in that moment, I realized this was just the beginning. The morning after I had signed the form with my parents, I woke up with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Not because the wedding was only 3 weeks away, not because I had a final dress fitting that afternoon, not because the seating chart still needed final adjustments, but because, for the first time in a long while, my yes to my family was fully under my control. It was precise, bounded, and most importantly, enforceable. I made coffee in the quiet of my apartment and looked at the contract one more time. The clause about the secondary event, the East Terrace, the 30-person limit, the standard beverage package, stood out like a tiny beacon. It was the exact perimeter of the yes I had given. Nothing more, nothing less. Every expectation, every assumption my parents and Amber might harbor about sharing the venue had to navigate that document now. It was a yes with teeth. A yes that would teach lessons quietly but unmistakably. I called Sandra before the rest of the day spun away. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm, professional, carrying the weight of 11 years of managing weddings and the chaos that inevitably followed them. "Claire," she said, "what's the situation?" I told her everything. Every nuance of the previous day, the ask, the guilt-laden conversation, the text about being generous, the signatures. I described the hopefulness that my parents carried into the paperwork, the confidence that my agreement would automatically translate into compliance. Sandra listened without interruption, and I watched the way her voice stayed steady, analytical, yet empathetic. "And what would you like to do about it?" she asked. "I want the agreement to reflect exactly what was agreed. No more, no less. Everything else has to be clearly off limits." There was a pause. "Understood. I'll draft the final secondary event addendum and review it with the team. I'll call you back in 50 minutes. 50 minutes later, she did. I read the document carefully. The East Terrace, capacity 30, 2-hour window, standard beverages. The ceremony space, the reception barn, the main lawn untouchable. All clear. Every expectation clarified. Every loophole closed. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about making my sister or my parents suffer. It was about ensuring the integrity of the wedding I had worked for, the day I had spent 18 months planning, the space I had saved for and envisioned since I was 23. After confirming the secondary event contract, I sent a copy to my parents. Gerald opened it with a practiced confidence that came from years of assuming my consent meant they could do anything. He signed it immediately, without reading the fine print. He trusted that if I said yes, the specifics didn't matter. That trust would prove costly. The afternoon passed in the quiet satisfaction of preparation. I made a final check of my own wedding schedule, reviewing the photographer's timeline, the florist's setup, the timing of the ceremony and reception. Every piece of the day was aligned with the boundaries I had set. Every yes had a corresponding no, and every no was now enforceable. That evening, Amber called. Her voice was bright, excited. "I just wanted to check on the catering. Can we add a signature cocktail? Can the florist adjust the flowers a bit?" She rattled through the requests with the same urgency she always brought to everything she wanted. I listened, smiling, polite, warm. Every single one of her asks had been written down, photographed, and sent to Sandra for context. None of them were part of the signed agreement. None would be accommodated. When I hung up, I sat quietly, holding the phone in my hand, savoring the calm that had settled around me. For the first time, saying yes had felt like power. Not loud, not flashy, not confrontational, just precise, bounded, effective. This was the kind of yes that shifted the architecture of the day, without anyone realizing that a shift had occurred until it was too late. I went to bed that night with the serene fatigue of someone who had done exactly what was necessary. The weight of obligation, guilt, and compromise had lifted, replaced by a quiet, disciplined satisfaction. The day I had imagined since I was 23 was coming, and this time it would be entirely mine. The morning arrived quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air feel dense, like fog over a still river. I had anticipated this day, mapped it out in my mind, rehearsed the words I would use, the pauses I would allow, the firmness I would project. And yet, anticipation didn't make it any less nerve-wracking. Today was the first true test of the boundaries I had so meticulously drawn. My parents had long operated under a single assumption. Once I said yes, every nuance of my consent could be bent in their favor. I had spent the past 18 months meticulously planning, negotiating, and protecting the day I had envisioned. This yes, the one embedded in the contracts and the addendum, wasn't just a gesture. It was enforceable, and they had no idea. Breakfast began innocuously, but the first ripple of the day's challenge appeared almost immediately. My mom stirred her coffee with casual precision, her voice light but carrying the hint of expectation. "So, about the East Terrace," she said, tilting her head as if it were idle chatter. "Maybe we could squeeze a few more people in. It wouldn't be that bad." I looked up calmly, allowing the words to settle before I responded. Every muscle in me tensed inwardly, but outwardly I remained composed. "Mom," I said slowly, carefully, "the terrace is capped at 30 people. That's the limit in the addendum. No exceptions." Her smile faltered, the subtle quiver betraying the disappointment she tried to mask. "Oh, it's just a few more. Surely it won't matter." "It does matter," I replied, deliberately firm, my voice soft but immovable. "Adding more people violates the terms. We can't do it." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and deliberate. For the first time in years, my parents weren't driving the conversation. They weren't directing the outcome. They were waiting quietly for me to fold. I didn't. I let the pause stretch, and slowly, consciously or not, Mom set her coffee down, the acknowledgement of the line drawn hanging in the air like a faint but undeniable presence. By mid-morning, the first messages arrived from Amber. Bright, effervescent, oblivious to the internal battle already unfolding. "Can we tweak the dessert menu? Maybe add extra champagne?" she asked, each word punctuated with exclamation points, urgency, and expectation. I responded methodically, polite, firm, professional. I cited the signed documents, the explicit terms of the addendum. No deviation, no compromise. Every yes I had granted had a corresponding no, and I enforced it without hesitation. Later, Gerald called, his tone deceptively casual, laced with curiosity and subtle probing. "So everything's set for the terrace, right? No issues." I explained the constraints again, without emotion, without apology. "Exactly as agreed. Anything outside that scope isn't authorized." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a faint flicker of disbelief, as though he had forgotten that the days of automatic compliance were over. For years, my parents had assumed my assent was interchangeable with acquiescence. They had counted on my willingness to adjust, to compromise, to make everyone else comfortable. Today, that assumption would crumble quietly, invisibly, but irrevocably. By afternoon, the cracks in their strategy began to surface. My mom attempted one final, subtle approach, using sentiment as leverage. "Claire," she said softly, almost coaxingly, "it's just a few more people. Don't you want everyone to be happy?" I let the words hang, heavy with their implied demand. And then I replied, deliberate and calm, my voice carrying the weight of clarity and principle. "Happiness isn't the issue. Compliance with the agreement is. That's what ensures the day goes smoothly for everyone, including you." That was all it took. The quiet satisfaction that settled over me was not derived from winning an argument. It was deeper, more profound. It came from reclaiming agency, from demonstrating that my yes could be precise, deliberate, and respected, even against years of expectation, habitual bending, and subtle pressure. The day passed with minor skirmishes, each a micro-test of the boundaries I had established. Every casual suggestion, every well-meaning but misaligned request, every unspoken assumption was met with the same steady, unwavering refusal. With every interaction, I reinforced the idea that my decisions were no longer negotiable, that my consent was bounded, enforceable, and intentional. That evening, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, reviewing the day, the messages, the conversations, the subtle power struggles disguised as casual family banter. Each instance was a test, and I had passed them all. The lesson was clear. Boundaries are only powerful when enforced consistently. And now, for the first time in years, my family understood that my yes was not a suggestion. It was a defined action, with consequences protected by enforceable measures. The real wedding was still weeks away, but the foundation was set. The day I had imagined, crafted, and defended was protected. Every assumption had been challenged, every potential breach accounted for, and every stakeholder had been reminded, silently, quietly, but unmistakably, that the architecture of my consent was no longer negotiable. And then, just as I started to feel the first real satisfaction of agency regained, my phone buzzed with another message from Amber, cheerful as ever. "Can we use the East Terrace for an additional floral arrangement?" I stared at it for a long moment, smiled faintly, set my phone aside. Every boundary had been drawn, every plan enforced, and I was ready. But in the back of my mind, a small, insistent thought lingered. Sometimes the first real test is only the beginning. And I knew that the next challenge wouldn't come from my family. It would come from somewhere else, someone outside the inner circle, someone who might question the enforceability of every decision I had so carefully secured. The morning arrived with a quiet so deliberate it felt sacred. Hartwell Vineyard lay still beneath the pale gold of dawn, the long rows of grapevines etched sharply against the awakening sky, dew glistening faintly like scattered gems. Every shadow, every slant of sunlight, every faint breeze carried a subtle reassurance. This was the day I had envisioned for 18 months, and I had claimed it with every measure of foresight I could muster. I pulled up in the car at precisely 8 o'clock, the moment my exclusive contract allowed. The engine ticked as it cooled, the smell of dew and cut grass filling the air with a crisp, almost intoxicating sense of promise. I took a slow breath, centering myself, and glanced at the vineyard gates. Sandra was already there, clipboard in hand, her calm presence a steadying counterpoint to the whirlwind of anticipation that always accompanied wedding mornings. We exchanged a brief nod, a silent affirmation that everything was in place, that every detail had been accounted for, and that no one would overstep the boundaries I had painstakingly constructed. Walking into the bridal suite, I was greeted by the familiar rhythm of wedding mornings. Bridesmaids moving in soft coordination, hair dryers humming a gentle percussion, champagne glasses clinking quietly in celebratory ritual. There was no chaos, no last-minute panic. For the first time in a long while, I felt an unusual serenity, an assurance born not from naivety but from control. Every variable I could manage had been anticipated, every scenario rehearsed. The morning version of me, slightly anxious, slightly unsure, was fading, replaced by the bride I had imagined for years, fully realized, fully present. I adjusted the folds of my dress in the mirror, letting the sunlight skim the fabric, letting the reflection settle me. This was the moment I had been working toward. By 10:30, the first real challenge arrived. Amber entered the estate with Scott in tow, followed by my parents and a crowd far exceeding the 30-person limit for the East Terrace secondary event. 47, to be precise. They moved with the easy confidence of people accustomed to bending days to their will. The decorators they brought immediately swarmed toward the main lawn, positioning flowers and furniture with casual disregard for protocol. An independent photographer, camera bag slung over his shoulder, made a beeline for the ceremony space, ready to capture moments that weren't authorized. The scenario had been anticipated, mapped, and accounted for, but anticipation sharpened tension rather than eliminated it. Sandra met them at the perimeter of the main lawn, her stance calm, authoritative, and unyielding. She handed out the day's access map, a visual ledger of every permitted space, every assigned time, every constraint. She guided them step by step, making clear which areas were off-limits. The photographer was politely intercepted at the vineyard gate, informed that the ceremony space and main lawn were strictly inaccessible without express written authorization. The man blinked, muttered something about efficiency, but complied. Sandra's presence was more than instruction. It was strategy made visible, a living embodiment of the contract's enforceable terms. Amber sought me in the bridal suite, knocking politely. The door remained closed. A bridesmaid, managing the threshold, relayed the message in hushed tones. I was unavailable. The door clicked shut before Amber could protest further. Frustrated, she pivoted to Sandra, hoping to negotiate a workaround. The coordination office became the theater of subtle power. Sandra greeted Amber with warm professionalism, yet every boundary remained unbreached. The signed addendum lay flat on the desk. Amber's eyes traced the lines, confusion flickering across her face. "This isn't what we discussed," she said, a rising edge in her voice betraying the tension building beneath her composed exterior. "This is what was booked," Sandra replied evenly, her tone carrying the weight of careful planning and quiet authority. Gerald leaned in, scanning for loopholes for a soft edge to exploit. Sandra remained unflinching, walking him through every clause, every restriction, each precisely allocated resource. Every expectation Gerald assumed was embedded in his signature was, in fact, tightly circumscribed. He had signed, trusting that my yes was all that mattered, but Sandra ensured that the contract's teeth were fully engaged. Later, through a bridesmaid's discreet message, Patricia asked to speak with me. Bouquet in hand, veil carefully adjusted, I considered her request. Sunlight streamed across the folds of my gown, illuminating my deliberate calm. I spoke quietly without apology. "Tell them I'm getting married today. I'll see them at the ceremony." Turning back to the mirror, I inhaled slowly. The reflection, the sunlight, the dress, the day itself, it all aligned. "There it is," I whispered, a quiet acknowledgement of planning executed flawlessly. Throughout the morning, the rhythm of the estate followed my design. Every vendor knew their boundaries, every attempt to overstep was contained, every challenge met with precise enforcement. The East Terrace remained exactly as intended, a contained, well-defined space, available only for the secondary event with its 30-person limit, its time frame, and its modest provisions intact. No encroachment was permitted. Every detail I had anticipated, the flows of people, the entry points, the vendor movements, was accounted for, mapped, and reinforced in real time. By midday, the calm had settled into something almost tangible, a quiet triumph made possible by meticulous planning and disciplined enforcement. The guests, oblivious to the behind-the-scenes vigilance, moved through the estate unaware that every expectation, every assumption, every gesture had been anticipated and contained. The morning was more than serenity. It was proof, tangible and undeniable, that boundaries had weight, that a yes could be measured, enforced, and respected. And then, just as I allowed myself a fleeting sense of satisfaction, a flicker of reminder passed through my mind. The day was far from over. Every guest, every vendor, every subtle human assumption was poised to challenge the order I had carefully established. The East Terrace, perfectly defined, would soon become the crucible where planning met human unpredictability, where every boundary would be tested against expectation, desire, and entitlement. This was the calm before the ceremony. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness I felt it, the quiet, precise, inevitable proof that this day belonged to me in every measure I had set. The sun had climbed just high enough to drench the estate in warm, golden light, but the morning's quiet remained unbroken, a fragile serenity that promised nothing would disrupt the day I had planned. Guests arrived, settling into their seats on the main lawn with murmurs of excitement, unaware of the subtle currents of control and anticipation flowing invisibly around them. I stood at the edge of the aisle, the soft rustle of my gown barely audible over the shuffling programs and whispered greetings. My heartbeat was steady, the kind of deliberate rhythm that comes from knowing you have accounted for every variable, foreseen every contingency, and prepared for every eventuality. Each step toward the center was a mental rehearsal, a choreography of poise, timing, and anticipation that had been etched in my mind over months of planning. Sandra, stationed near the ceremony arch, gave me a barely perceptible nod. That small, precise gesture carried reassurance, authority, and the unspoken message that the day would unfold exactly as I intended. Vendors, attendants, and musicians remained in their designated spaces, every detail adhered to with meticulous care. The photographer angled himself where the contract allowed, capturing moments not on whim, but on my terms. Even the musicians waited behind the velvet rope, a visual and auditory boundary, a reminder that control of the space belonged solely to me. At that moment, Amber appeared on the east terrace, flanked by a small entourage. Her eyes scanned the main lawn, calculating, assessing, searching for disorder, disruption, or a crack in my carefully maintained structure. Frustration flickered across her features, barely contained. She had expected chaos, or at least an opportunity to assert herself in ways that mattered to her. Instead, she found only order. Every path, every sightline, every area had been measured, cordoned, and contained. No one crossed a boundary without express authorization. I caught her glance from across the lawn, her disbelief mingling with quiet fury. But my focus remained on the aisle, each step deliberate, each movement aligned perfectly with the plan I had rehearsed countless times. The ceremony began. Vows were exchanged with the cadence and intimacy I had envisioned, each word chosen and delivered with the precision of a careful rhythm. Pauses landed exactly where they should, gestures fell into place, and the moments that might have been chaotic were orchestrated instead into an effortless flow. The guests leaned forward, captivated by the elegance and weight of a ceremony that felt as though it had been shaped by more than chance. Gerald muttered under his breath, frustration barely concealed, realizing the extent of control I had maintained over every element. My parents, equally constrained, sat rigidly in their seats, unable to influence, intervene, or redirect the course of events. Power, I realized, did not always announce itself with loud confrontation. It often resided in precision, foresight, and unwavering enforcement. By the time the final blessing was spoken, applause rippled across the lawn, filling the air with approval and closure. Hand in hand with Daniel, I stepped off the aisle, feeling the world tilt precisely as I had imagined it. Sandra intercepted Amber once more, guiding her quietly but firmly back to the east terrace, where she could watch but could not interfere. The tension was subtle yet electric. Amber's presence was contained, visible, yet strategically neutralized. The first victory of the day had been claimed. Order, foresight, and strategy had triumphed over expectation, impulsiveness, and entitlement. Even as congratulations poured in and I smiled at friends and relatives, I allowed myself a moment to inhale fully, to feel the weight of control and accomplishment. The morning's work, the careful enforcement of contracts, the anticipation of every request, the unwavering boundary setting, had resulted in a seamless ceremony. Every attempt to bend the day to someone else's will had been neutralized. And yet, I knew the reception loomed. The East Terrace, serene now, would not remain a passive observer. Amber's determination, the subtle alliances forming among her entourage, and the natural pull of curiosity would soon test the boundaries I had so carefully constructed. Today was mine, but the next phase of the day would demand vigilance, strategy, and the same precision that had brought this moment to flawless completion. The calm before the reception was not merely quiet, it was the poised tension of a battlefield perfectly mapped. Every guest, every gesture, every expectation would be met with boundaries enforced and lessons silently taught. The day was unfolding as I had designed, but the next challenge, subtle, persistent, and unpredictable, was already waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. The reception barn glowed with a soft, golden luminescence, the kind of light that feels deliberately placed to make every detail sing. Sandra had choreographed it months ago, and now the afternoon sun slanted through the high windows just as we had imagined, casting linear shadows across polished oak beams and highlighting the warmth of the space. Tables were arranged with geometric precision, each centerpiece aligned with the floral design, linens taut and flawless, every fork and knife in its prescribed place. The scent of roses, peonies, and subtle greenery mingled with the aroma of freshly prepared hors d'oeuvres, grounding me in a space I had crafted down to the last nuance. Guests streamed in, laughter and conversation filling the barn, oblivious to the invisible currents of control threading the room. I moved slowly between tables, every step deliberate, absorbing the fruition of 18 months of planning like a physical weight settling into place. Daniel's hand found mine, steady, grounding, a reminder that this day was ours. Every nod I returned, every soft smile, reinforced the reality that the space, the day, was exactly as I intended. This barn, this light, these guests, they existed within the perimeter I had drawn, a domain I had defended with foresight and precision. Outside, the East Terrace, the site of Amber's engagement celebration, was now quiet. The 2-hour window had ended precisely at 1 o'clock. The extra guests, who had exceeded the 30-person limit stipulated in the addendum, dispersed reluctantly, awkward glances exchanged as they realized there was no place left for their lingering presence. The florals, cream, and sage as planned, were carefully packed into the decorator's van, their fleeting grandeur a reminder of limits enforced. The independent photographer, who had tried to capture more than the contract allowed, loaded equipment with meticulous efficiency, aware that only a fraction of Amber's envisioned event had been documented. The first phone call came at 3:47 p.m., sharp and expectant. Gerald's voice, tight with indignation and brimming with unspoken frustration, cut through the hum of the reception. He enumerated perceived grievances as if reciting a litany. The East Terrace's limitations, the absence of champagne in the areas they had imagined, the way some guests had nowhere to go. Each complaint hung in the air, a challenge to the authority I had carefully established. I stepped aside into a quiet corridor, placing the phone between us and the flow of the reception, listening without yielding. "Dad," I said, measured, calm, each syllable deliberate, "I agreed to share the venue. Amber had an engagement cocktail on the East Terrace, a beautiful space, exactly as booked." "That's not what you agreed to," he replied, every word edged with frustration, disbelief lining his tone. "It's what the contract says," I said evenly, letting the weight of formal authority settle between us. His assumptions, his sense of entitlement, his family hierarchy, they were irrelevant now. Each restriction I had laid down was enforceable, precise, and documented. The silence on the other end told me that the shift in power was registering, even if unwillingly. Gerald paused, perhaps realizing for the first time that his expectations held no sway against clearly codified rules. Then Patricia called. Her voice was unsteady, tinged with tears, the raw, urgent emotion that had defined the opening of this story. Words tumbled over one another. Amber's embarrassment, guests' confusion, outrage at the tiny scale of the event, the perceived slight of being limited to a narrow terrace. Patricia's panic was a storm. I was the calm center. "Mum," I said softly, firmly, "I shared the venue. Amber had her engagement party on the East Terrace. The terms were followed exactly as agreed." Silence. Her sigh was almost audible through the line, a subtle acknowledgement that rules, once written and enforced, carried more weight than appeals, emotions, or long-standing assumptions. "This isn't the daughter I raised," she murmured, fragmented, a blend of grief, resignation, and disbelief. "I'm getting married today," I said, my voice soft but uncompromising. "I'll call tomorrow. I love you." And with that, I ended the call, returning to the barn, to Daniel, to the ceremony and celebration that had been safeguarded by preparation, foresight, and deliberate enforcement. Daniel met my gaze, eyes wide but steady. "Both of them?" he asked quietly, comprehension dawning. "Yes," I said, lifting my glass in a silent acknowledgement. "Within the hour." Sandra appeared at the doorway, a subtle nod of approval passing between us, a shared acknowledgement of the flawless execution of our plan. The reception resumed without disruption. Light spilled through the high windows exactly as designed. Music, conversation, laughter, and clinking glasses filled the barn with life. Every element of the day, the menu, the seating, the ambience, remained within the framework I had so carefully constructed. The East Terrace had emptied, its echoes a testament to precision, the consequences of clear boundaries, and the enforcement of a yes that carried the weight of authority. Guests moved through the reception unaware, oblivious, yet enveloped by the structure that kept chaos at bay. Every action outside the barn now reflected the enforcement of careful planning, proof that when authority is backed by preparation, control can be exercised without confrontation, subtly, irrevocably. The day belonged to us, but the reverberations of the decisions made weeks ago, of contracts read and clauses enforced, had only just begun. Every ripple of frustration, every quiet realization of limitations, would echo through the family long after the champagne had been poured and the guests had left. The morning after the reception arrived with a silence that felt almost sacred, but beneath it lay a tangible tension, like the still air before a storm. The guests had departed, leaving behind faint traces of laughter, the lingering scent of cream and sage florals, and the subtle hum of music that Sandra's team had carefully arranged for the barn. To anyone walking through the estate, it would have seemed serene, even ordinary. But for my family, the echoes of the day hung like invisible chains. Every measured entrance, every delineated aisle, every unobtrusive enforcement of the secondary event agreement had left marks they couldn't yet articulate, but that were deeply felt. Gerald paced the study, phone in hand, muttering fragments of the previous day's conversations under his breath. Each step was a cadence of disbelief. She controlled everything, even the terrace. She didn't even need to yell every guest. The words tumbled out, disconnected, as though speaking them might conjure a different reality. His frustration wasn't just about the minor constraints of the East Terrace or the limitations of Amber's event. It was the realization that the framework of authority had shifted beneath him without confrontation, argument, or warning. The power he had taken for granted, his ability to bend, adjust, or subtly manipulate, was gone. Patricia sat on the edge of her bed, shoulders tense, staring at the blank wall across from her. Her mind replayed every interaction, every polite refusal, every documented limitation that had constrained what she had assumed would be her daughter's instinct to yield. Claire, the daughter she had thought she knew, had become someone new in the span of 18 months, someone who wielded authority not with drama or declaration, but with precision, enforceable and undeniable. She traced her fingers along the edge of the floral arrangement on her nightstand, as if the symmetry and order could somehow explain what had occurred. It couldn't. Amber was the first to call, cautiously triumphant. Her voice carried awe and relief, a rare combination for someone so accustomed to expecting concessions. "It was perfect," she said softly. "Everything looked amazing. Nobody could touch it. I don't think anyone realized how exact it all was." I smiled faintly, aware that Amber's gratitude had little to do with flowers or lighting or music. It was rooted in the invisible scaffolding I had constructed, the boundaries, the contracts, the preemptive enforcement that had turned assumptions into powerless gestures. Daniel and I walked through the aftermath together, surveying the remnants of tables, linens, and decorations still being packed into vans. "It's strange," he said quietly, brushing a hand over the polished wood of the barn floor, "how something so beautiful can make people feel small." I nodded. That was exactly the effect I had anticipated, not from malice, but from the nature of authority itself. It exists unseen, intangible, until exercised, and when it is exercised with clarity, it cannot be ignored. The East Terrace, empty now and meticulously restored to its neutral state, was the symbolic epicenter of that lesson. To the casual observer, it had seemed trivial. In reality, it had been the pivot on which the family's power dynamics rotated. The calls began in earnest mid-morning. Gerald attempted reason, layering irritation over assumed leverage. Claire, this isn't how it was supposed to work. Amber, the guests, the terrace, none of this was supposed to be restricted. I listened, calm, letting him exhaust himself in outlines of grievance. Then I repeated the facts precisely. Dad, Amber had her engagement cocktail on the East Terrace. It was approved, executed, and concluded according to the terms we agreed on. No deviations occurred. His voice wavered. But we thought— I understand what you thought, I said, soft but unwavering. But thought does not alter the documented agreement. It was your assumption, not my failure, that anything beyond that could happen. A long pause followed. He sighed audibly, almost defeated. The reality was beginning to penetrate. Authority was no longer inherited by default in this family. It could be claimed, asserted, and maintained, but only with preparation and deliberate consistency. Patricia called next. Tears lined her voice, shaky and fraught with disbelief. Words tumbled in fragmented bursts, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and confusion. Amber was humiliated, the guests shocked, and she herself could not reconcile the daughter she knew with the woman she had just witnessed orchestrate a flawless event. I'm getting married today, I said gently but firmly. I shared the venue as agreed. Everything was executed within the framework we established. I love you, but I'll call tomorrow. I hung up, returning to the barn as if nothing had transpired. The contrast between the controlled celebration inside and the storm of emotions outside was stark, and Daniel understood it immediately. Both of them? He asked, voice low, disbelief evident. Yes, I said, raising my glass in acknowledgement, letting the quiet satisfaction settle like sunlight across the room. Within the hour. Sandra passed by with a subtle nod, the professional equivalent of applause. Every detail had been observed, enforced, and executed. The golden light streamed through the windows, illuminating the polished oak, the carefully curated florals, the soft laughter of guests, all oblivious to the invisible architecture holding chaos at bay. The East Terrace, now empty, bore silent testimony to the exercise of authority. Its boundaries had been respected, its capacity enforced, its rules upheld. Yet the reverberations of yesterday's meticulous planning were far from over. Every whispered conversation, every private reflection, every tentative text in the aftermath carried the weight of a new reality. That precision and preparation could redefine expectations, recalibrate relationships, and shift power in ways that no anger, persuasion, or familial precedent could counteract. By evening, the house was quiet again. Light faded through the windows, shadows lengthening across the floors, echoing the quiet but inexorable reach of control. Every ripple from the previous day extended outward, subtle, nearly invisible, yet undeniable. The family could no longer navigate the world with assumptions. They had to confront a truth that had arrived gently, persistently, and unassailably. Claire's yes was measured, bounded, enforceable, and now irrevocable. By 2 in the afternoon, the East Terrace had emptied almost completely, save for Amber and Scott. The space, once a vibrant microcosm of anticipation and social energy, had contracted into a quiet, almost clinical landscape. Cream and sage florals, now half-packed into cardboard boxes, lined the edges. Scattered napkins bore the faint fingerprints of hurried celebration. A lingering note of wine mingled with the warm spring air, but even it seemed subdued, as if the atmosphere itself recognized the boundaries that had been imposed. Amber and Scott sat in the shadow of the low hedge separating the terrace from the main vineyard, a natural and symbolic boundary in itself. Through the green lattice, she could see the wedding in progress. Tables aligned perfectly, flowers blooming in calculated symmetry, guests laughing in precise, measured groups, music wafting in carefully balanced crescendos. Every detail reflected someone else's design, someone else's control. She watched a cluster of children dart across the lawn, a photographer bending to catch a perfect angle, and felt an acute awareness of absence. This was Claire's day in every sense. Orchestrated, uninterrupted, alive with intent, and Amber's event existed only as a shadow in comparison. Amber thought back to the video call 11 days prior. She had been excited, even confident, as she screen-shared her meticulously color-coded itinerary, the one outlining seating plans, floral preferences, and a timeline of her small engagement celebration. Claire had nodded, made notes, and said she'd check with Sandra. At the time, Amber interpreted the pause as routine diligence. Now, sitting amidst the aftermath, the clarity settled in painfully. That pause had not been indecision. It had been the prelude to control. Amber had misread every subtle cue, every nuance. The unspoken question she had avoided, the one she never asked herself, finally had an answer. She was not entitled to this space on this day. Not today, not ever within the constraints Claire had set. Scott remained beside her, silent, unwavering. He didn't offer consolation, argument, or justification. His presence was steady, grounding, a quiet acknowledgement that the moment belonged solely to Amber's reckoning. "You're going to call her," he said gently. Amber shook her head, eyes still tracing the delicate lines of the vineyard where the wedding hummed, a world vibrating with energy just out of reach. "Not today," she whispered. Her voice was soft, tinged with reluctant acceptance. Today there was nothing she could do. Today the boundaries were immutable. The terrace team continued their post-event sweep, methodical and deliberate. Chairs were stacked and aligned with machine-like precision, tables wiped clean of stray crumbs, florals packed without disruption. Each measured action underscored Amber's marginalization, the subtle assertion of rules she had neither defined nor enforced. Even the distant hum of the main reception, the laughter, clinking glasses, and the filtered notes of a string quartet, seemed almost accusatory, a reminder that Claire's space thrived because of structure, whereas Amber's efforts were ephemeral, incomplete, and contained. Aunt Melissa arrived quietly, jacket in hand, stepping onto the terrace with an ease that belied the tension. She sat beside Amber, gazing through the hedge with the calm of someone who had witnessed countless family dramas, yet recognized the truth when it was unavoidable. "This was always Claire's day, sweetheart," she said softly. Her tone carried neither judgment nor pity, only the matter-of-fact clarity of someone speaking a reality too long ignored. Amber nodded, letting the words settle. It was neither rebuke nor consolation. It was acknowledgement, a mirror reflecting the outcome she had failed to account for. Amber looked down at the green dress she had changed into earlier that morning, its folds heavy with compromise and self-restraint. The physical manifestation of her attempt to adjust, to fit within invisible expectations, now felt almost performative, a token in the theater of someone else's design. The afternoon sun carved the terrace into angles of shadow and light, drawing lines that mirrored the boundaries Claire had set, the lines Amber could see but not cross. Every breeze that stirred the blossoms, every faint note of music drifting across the hedge, served as a quiet reminder. Control had been exercised, observed, and enforced flawlessly. In the silence, Amber's understanding deepened. This wasn't about Claire's generosity. It was about assumptions, about entitlement, about the subtle power embedded in the architecture of planning. She realized that intention alone carried no weight. Only structure, boundaries, and enforceable agreements did. Each detail of Claire's day, the music, the flowers, the placement of each guest, was a manifestation of that power. Amber could witness it, feel its presence, even measure its reach, but she could not inhabit it. And that realization, quiet as it was, carried a sharp clarity. The most effective authority is invisible until it asserts itself, and when it does, it cannot be ignored. Scott leaned back slightly, silent, a constant anchor in the space. He said nothing, allowed Amber the room to absorb the lesson in her own time. The vineyard stretched beyond them, sunlit and orderly, indifferent to drama but entirely shaped by the meticulous precision of one person who understood the rules and enforced them without hesitation. Outside the hedge, Claire's wedding continued, untouchable and intact, while inside Amber's mind, the echo of boundaries being respected, authority being claimed, and assumptions being corrected resonated with quiet, inexorable power. By mid-afternoon, the East Terrace had quieted completely. The last of Amber's engagement guests had drifted away, leaving behind only the faint trace of florals and the subtle echo of a celebration that had never fully belonged to them. In that stillness, Gerald and Patricia requested a meeting with Sandra. The coordinator agreed, noting she had 15 minutes before the next scheduled check-in. It was enough. They entered her office, a room of calm, exacting order. Papers were stacked in neat, deliberate piles. Schedules were pinned on corkboards with geometric precision. Sunlight filtered through blinds to fall in perfect rectangles across the polished wood desk. Every surface reflected an efficiency and authority born of experience, the quiet assertion that no detail, no dispute, could escape observation. Sandra gestured toward the chairs. "Please sit," she said, her tone both warm and deliberate. "How can I help?" The parents did not hesitate. They launched immediately into their account, their words tumbling over one another in the urgency of disbelief. Gerald spoke first, his voice taut with indignation. "We were told the venue would be shared." Claire agreed. The family expected a joint celebration. 47 people traveled. Amber wore a white dress. The extended family came expecting something else. He spoke with the certainty of someone whose assumptions had long gone unchallenged, the conviction that logic and morality naturally aligned with his perspective. Patricia, quieter but no less insistent, added her own plea. "We've always tried to be fair to both girls." Her tone carried a fragility beneath its insistence, a desperate hope that fairness could still override the reality before them. Sandra listened. She remained seated, composed, arms resting lightly on the desk, her expression neutral. She let them enumerate every grievance, repeat every assumption, recount each detail of the day that had unsettled them. Only when they had exhausted the narrative did she begin, deliberate and unhurried, to walk them through the signed agreement. "Your daughter agreed to a secondary event," she said evenly, within the precise terms of her exclusive contract. Those terms were outlined clearly in the document you signed. Gerald's shoulders stiffened. "I signed it because Claire is family. I didn't think I needed to read it carefully," he admitted, a trace of defensiveness threading through his voice. Sandra held their gaze evenly, her calm unwavering. "I understand. I also understand that your daughter treats the details as the locus of her authority. For her, the details are where her interests live." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Gerald and Patricia shifted in their seats, a subtle but unmistakable unease threading through their certainty. The room seemed to amplify the realization. They were confronting consequences they had not anticipated, a reality constructed with precision, not malice. Patricia's voice softened, almost pleading now. "We wanted to support both daughters. We didn't intend for this to cause conflict." Sandra's reply was gentle but firm. "I'm certain you did, but today has shown you how those intentions intersect with structure. Claire has spent 18 months planning this day. Every element, contracts, timelines, vendor coordination, boundaries, has been built deliberately. The secondary event unfolded exactly as it was meant to because it was bounded by rules and enforced professionally." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Did Claire plan all of this?" The question was accusatory, incredulous, a mixture of awe and frustration. Sandra nodded. "She did, and she executed it within the framework you agreed to. She gave a yes, but that yes was structured, specific, documented. Limits were set. Enforcement was clear." The office seemed to breathe around them. The papers, the schedules, the quiet authority of Sandra herself pressed on Gerald and Patricia with an almost physical weight. Their daughter was no longer the pliable, accommodating presence they had assumed. She was a strategist, a planner, a guardian of her own day. The implications settled slowly, quietly, profoundly. Patricia's voice broke slightly. "We expected more flexibility," she said, almost to herself. Sandra tilted her head, allowing the words to linger. "Flexibility has its place," she said, "but it cannot override prior agreements or the intentions of someone who has dedicated years to realizing her vision. Claire's day was constructed intentionally for the life she wants to begin. Today is not about your expectations. Today is about what she built." Silence followed, a long, uncomfortable pause. Gerald and Patricia absorbed the reality of the meticulously maintained boundaries, the contracts, the enforceable structure, and the quiet, unshakable control Claire had exercised. The office contained them, the papers, and the weight of their realization, leaving no room for argument, no loophole to exploit. Sandra stood, gathering the documents with deliberate care. "I'm sorry the day wasn't what you anticipated," she said softly, "but I hope it is everything your daughter wanted." With that, she left them alone in the office. The quiet hum of the space carried the echo of their reckoning. The weight of the day, the contracts, and Claire's unyielding yes settled over them like a tangible presence. Outside, the wedding continued, perfect, undisturbed, unyielding in its rhythm. Inside, Gerald and Patricia faced the consequences of underestimating the architecture of control their daughter had built. Every expectation, every assumption, every familiar dynamic had shifted, quietly but irrevocably. As twilight settled over the vineyard, the last guests drifted away, carrying snapshots, laughter, and fleeting echoes of music. The air was tinged with the soft scent of cream and sage florals and the faint warmth of spent candles. The day had concluded, but its reverberations were far from over. Claire's wedding had been flawless in every outward sense, but beneath the surface, the most consequential work had already been done. The unyielding assertion of boundaries, the recalibration of expectations, the quiet enforcement of authority. Back at the family home, Gerald and Patricia sat in the living room, silence stretching between them like a taut wire. The day's events played on repeat in their minds. The contracts, the precise limitations of the East Terrace, the invisible scaffolding of rules that Claire had so carefully constructed. Gerald ran a hand over his face, a mixture of fatigue and dawning comprehension etched in the lines of his brow. "I thought we were helping," he muttered, voice heavy with self-reproach. Patricia's eyes reflected equal measure of awe and uncertainty. "We thought it was flexibility," she said softly, "but it was structure. Claire, she built this life herself." The certainty they had long relied on was gone, replaced by an almost reluctant admiration and the uneasy awareness that they had underestimated her entirely. Meanwhile, Claire retired to her suite, physically spent but inwardly steady. The dress was carefully folded, the shoes set aside, and the room smelled faintly of lavender and silk. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, acknowledging the significance of what had unfolded. This was more than a wedding. It was a demonstration. Boundaries could be enforced without confrontation. Clarity could override expectation. Preparation could outmaneuver assumption. She had not raised her voice, had not yielded, had not flinched. Every yes had been precise, every no immovable. Every detail of her day had been protected, and it had worked. The following morning, the celebratory phone calls began. Friends, cousins, distant relatives, all expressing admiration for a wedding executed with elegance, grace, and exacting control. Yet the call that mattered most lingered unanswered, a quiet test of acknowledgement. Gerald finally dialed, his tone cautious, measured. "Claire," he began, we understand now. We weren't expecting all of this, but we see what you've done. We want to respect your day and your choices." Patricia's voice added softly, It'll take some time to adjust, but we are proud of you." Claire's reply was calm, precise, and without excess. "Thank you," she said. "That's all I needed to hear. I hope we can move forward with understanding, not assumptions." A pause followed. A brief silence waited with recognition. The family landscape had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Boundaries had been asserted. Expectations had been reframed. Authority had been exercised without bitterness or drama. By the day's end, the lesson was clear to everyone involved. Ownership over one's life, one's time, and one's celebrations is defined not by argument alone, but by clarity, preparation, and the courage to enforce what has been deliberately chosen. Claire's wedding was not merely a celebration. It was a blueprint for navigating relationships, autonomy, and respect. In the quiet aftermath, the music had faded, but its impact endured. The ripples of intention, discipline, and precise yeses would shape the family's interactions for years to come. A subtle yet indelible testament to the power of structure and self-determination.